I'm David Velasco. I'm the editor-in-chief of Artform magazine. Today I'm speaking with the incredible Emmelyn Butterfield-Rosen, who's the author of the extraordinary piece on Titian's Poesie, painted poems that he made between 1551 and 1562, which she wrote for the April issue of Artforum. And in fact, our cover this month is the final painting in the series, The Rape of Europa, completed in Venice in 1562. The opening character is, in fact, the face of the Spanish pointer in Titian's Diana and Callisto. And I wondered how you first arrived at that face, like what first drew you to that face?
Years ago, without an intention, just by chance, I was in Rome in 2013 and I saw the big Titian retrospective that was at the Quirinale at that time. And I remember being like totally blown away by the Flaying of Marsyas. I thought that it was like one of the most incredibly self-reflexive paintings about painterly process that I had ever seen. And I was struck at that time by this little spaniel licking blood, and this blood was kind of both blood and obviously a metaphor for paint. And I had kind of, that always had sort of like stuck somewhere in the very, very back of my mind. But then I was interested, I wanted to work on the Titian because, you know, I'm coming out of just finishing a book, and the last chapter of that book is about Afternoon of a Faun, the Nijinsky ballet, which is based in turn on Stefan Mallarmé's poem of the same name, which is based on a myth from Ovid. It's a myth of foiled rape of Pan, the goat god, who tries to rape this nymph who's actually one of Diana's nymphs, Syrinx, and she, as a way of escaping the rape, transforms herself into a reed. So she evades the rape, and Pan invents the mouth organ, the panpipes. Part of what was most shocking about the ballet Afternoon of a Faun for a late 19th century audience was actually the fact that this faun was refusing to rape. He actually didn't seem to be aiming for penetrative coitus. He's engaging in exhibitionistic acts, and at the end of the ballet, masturbation. So it was this total rerouting of classical Ovidian myths of rape. And in the process of writing that, I got into reading about Ovid and mythology and rape in the Metamorphosis. And then I remembered Titian, and I thought that I would be excited by this exhibition, and I was. You know, also in my book, I've been very interested in pets, you know, human-animal relationships. I've written a lot about the relationship between the bustled woman and the monkey in Seurat's Grand Jatte. So I think I'm kind of like a person primed to be looking for animals. I work on Darwin, especially Darwin's theory of sexual selection. And it's about, you know, the emergence of sexual dimorphism in animals. It's also about it's a theory for the emergence of race in the human species, but it also drawn me to animals' sexuality, the dimorphism of animal bodies. And so I was primed, I think, when I went to the Titian show, but I've never thought seriously about dogs, and I didn't have any intentions in that regard. But once I recognized, and I came to this recognition, not myself actually, but through dialogue, that the dog in the two Diana paintings was the same dog. When I saw that, I'm like, oh boy, like there's a dog that ate his master at the center of this painting, staring out at me. And something's going on here. And because I believe that these paintings are about guilt and culpability, and I began to see that this dog was reappearing across the series, I just began to feel that this was an area where I could push.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why the paintings are about guilt and culpability, or in what ways. I mean, I think that's you have a very layered take on how, you know, they function both mythologically, but also within this historic context, which is that they were painted for Philip II. Philip ascended the throne, became a king of Spain, you know, thus the ruler of the first real, truly hemispheric empire. So I wonder if you could talk about how they were painted, the world in which they were painted, and why that matters.
Well, sure. So I think, you know, Titian, at the time that he meets Philip, Philip as is a prince, is arguably the most celebrated prominent painter in Europe. Philip is a prince and he's going to ascend the throne, inheriting, the global Spanish Empire half a century in the wake of 1492. There was no way for me to enter into thinking about these paintings without thinking about the context of the Spanish Empire. And also a transformative moment for me in the writing was when I thought about Bénédicte Boiseron's Afro Dog, Blackness and the Animal Question. And then a turning point was when Boiseron invokes Las Casas and actually mentions the figure of the dog becoming central in Las Casas. And then it came to me that I began to think about Philip as a double recipient, a recipient of Titian's paintings and also the addressee of this, most kind of a foundation, the text that, all students are kind of taught as, a foundational anti-colonial tract. And its addressee is Philip. So he's the recipient of both of these two very different kind of cultural forms of address to him. And then it was when I began on that track that I discovered the manuscript of the dogging and other American representations of Spanish canine colonists. Seeing the dog reappear in all of these contexts, separate contexts that aren't necessarily talking to each other, but that we can put into conversation. That for me was when I became interested in the work.
Could we very quickly also say what the exhibitions are that you're tracking here?
Yes, at some point a few years ago, I'm sure this is something people have wanted to do for a really long time. The various museums that own individual works within the Poesy cycle came together to unite them. The works are in the Prado, they're in the National Gallery in London, or the Wellington collection, the National Museums in Edinburgh, and also, the final work in the cycle, The Rape of Europa, is at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. And the show traveled to different venues. I saw it at the Gardner.
It's also just interesting because, of course, the painting is an allegory for in fact, not the rape of Europe, but the birth of Europe. I mean, in this more literal sense, it's about the sex, it's about the violence that that is at the founding of Europe. So it's also not as consistent of a metaphor as one might think necessarily, or it's certainly ambiguous in how you could apply it.
What I think is so interesting about the dog and why it's so important in the Titian is that the dog is paradoxically kind of like simultaneously a figure who's associated with utmost trainability, docility, and obedience, and also kind of the innateness of nature and instinct. And those two things kind of coexist within the figure of the dog, and the dog as an emblem has been driven in both directions in terms of those kinds of trains of association. And I think they're held in tension in the Titian. I think that's what's quite interesting about the dog, and I think it has to do with the dog's kind of originary role as the first domesticated species.
So, we've talked about the dog in the Titians, but of course, one of the star animals in the cycle, which you end up on at the very end, is the bull in The Rape of Europa. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the bull.
Something that I did have in mind looking at that bull was, I was also incredibly interested in names. I tried and names of dogs. There's also a strange book, but Dogs of the Conquest. It has a lot of information in it. And there were a lot of different names of the different conquest canines. And one of the dogs, one of the most famous dogs, I think it was Ponce de Leon, was called Little Bull Calf. So I think it's also interesting that in the naming of the dogs, there's often allusions to yet other animals, including bulls. But really what made the visual link for me was the quality of gaze, that I felt that the gaze of the bull echoed the addressing gaze of the dog in, the dog that devours Actaeon that reappears in the Callisto painting. It's a gaze, potentially a gaze soliciting us as master, waiting for, what should I do? Can I proceed? Like, may I proceed?
you came up with the title, Men Are Dogs. It's not actually often that authors come up with their own titles, but in this case, you brought this to us and it was, I mean, how could we resist? I wonder if you could tell us about the title, how it emerged. It speaks to the piece, of course, very wonderfully.
It just kind of popped into my head, I think, when I first started looking at the paintings, and for the whole time that I was working on this piece, the song Atomic Dogs was also stuck in my head. It has this line, why must I do that? Why must I chase the cat? I think, I mean, and I was just thinking about how ubiquitous this trope was as a kind of, you know, an excuse, a condemnation. And it's ambiguous. And I mean, I guess the point of my piece is sort of that, you know, men are not dogs, or they need to recognize that they're not. I'm obviously sensitive to the fact that the human species is an animal species. And I think there's been a lot of thought recently about, you know, the animal status of humankind and post-humanism. And I'm reading all of that stuff and interested in it. But in this particular case, I think, the point of the title is that men can choose not to be dogs.